Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Double Helix History podcast. Today we're going to be exploring the impact of DNA testing on ideas about identity, ethnicity and race.
So throughout we're going to be hearing snippets from our focus groups and interviews with family historians from across the world, but we're also going to be hearing from a number of world famous experts on a number of the issues we're talking about.
And I'm really excited about this mixture of having really quite important thinkers in this field talking to us about these ideas, but also considering how it relates to ordinary experience and people's real kind of engagement with DNA through their family history practice. What do you think the kind of key things that were that came up when we talked to family historians around the world, Matt, about identity and race in relation to DNA?
Well, I think the number one thing was there was quite a lot of scepticism about this idea of genetic ethnicity. A certain amount of misunderstanding, a certain amount of questioning of what actually they are looking at when you get these results turn up on a screen that seem quite scientific and solid, like here's a definite 15% Scandinavian, definitely 20% this. And yeah, most people are sort of questioning of how they can rely on this.
Absolutely, and yeah, I agree. Quite a lot of our interviewees and participants, very smart, sophisticated users of data and information, and they were quite scathing at times about the ethnicity estimate, seeing it as a kind of just as a marketing tool oftentimes, and that they kind of ignored that often. Most of them, though, did raise some of the concerns that our experts will raise, which is that it's not everyone that has this kind of level of education in the area. Many people are being kind of drawn into this area through kind of marketing, which seems to sell. Really quite a strong product in terms of what this will tell you about your ethnicity and where you're from and who you are and that kind of thing. And it's all bound up with a question of ethnicity and race to a certain extent, background being defined in that way. So there's a certain amount of disquiet amongst the community we spoke with, I thought.
It's a strange thing because on the one hand, even having worked on this project for about a year now and done a lot of reading around the different issues that there are with this kind of testing and the kind of claims being made, I also kind of would love to, there's part of me that would really find it really compelling to be told you are 20% Viking or you are 14% Irish, despite the fact I know to a decent extent how flawed that might be as a concept.
Absolutely, and it's not just compelling, it's incredibly potent, isn't it? The idea that you might be able to tell someone who they are and to define someone in that way, it's really, this is why the marketing is using this, because it's a really strong narrative, it's a real strong way of selling this, even though when we talk to experts, when we consider this from the point of view of geneticists or from historians' point of view, the basis for these suggestions is complicated, to say the least, and the ethical issues associated with are very complicated, particularly outside of Europe. When one talks to the major companies about this, they are very careful about trying to educate people who are using their product. But our experience is that hasn't had as much of an effect as we might wish, and certainly I feel very strongly that there's a lot remaining for companies to do, for schools and universities and social organisations to do to educate communities about the impact of what DNA might mean to them in terms of their ethnicity or in terms of their community understanding. A really good example of this is the recent case of Elizabeth Warren, who's the senator from Massachusetts who's standing to be president of the United States. And Elizabeth Warren has been dogged for years by suggestions that she doesn't have Native American ancestry, which she claims. And at the end of 2018, she took a very high-profile DNA test, which seemed to prove that she had at least 10% of ethnic affiliation with other Native American groupings. Many Native American scholars and Native American communities got very, very upset with Elizabeth Warren for the fact that she was making political capital out of this, the fact that she was making a lot of kind of noise about this, and it was starting to sell the idea or present the idea that ethnicity was DNA and genetic ethnicity was the foundational issue in terms of your identity as Native American, and that also Native American is a very widely defined idea. tribal identity, indigenous identity. As many of these groups pointed out quite strongly, this is not all there is. In fact, there's many kind of examples of Native American communities resisting DNA and genetic evidence being used in terms of defining identity, for just the reason that you talked about, that it's not as simple as that. And actually, if you're Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, if you're First Nations, if you're indigenous, if you're Native American, the definitions of your identity are not purely genetic. In fact, genetics is oftentimes quite rejected by these communities as evidence in this kind of discussion. So Warren's intervention here is really interesting because she wants the kind of truth because it would be politically expedient for her to be able to say, I am Native American. I do have roots with this particular tribe. I affiliate with this community because it will mean that she can claim a kind of political identity, therefore. And it doesn't help her cause or her story that actually it's more complicated than that, and actually the very groups that she was seeking to kind of claim affiliation with are quite careful and worried about any kind of scientifically defining kind of identity.
Yeah, the ethnicity measurements come up, and we've tested, on one of 7 kids, we've tested 6 of the siblings. We've all got different ethnicity profiles.
Yeah.
My sister was 100% UK, or British, British Isles, effectively English. One of my brothers had a high percentage, apparently, sort of Scottish-Irish. Some of us have got Polish, some of us have got Southern European, and we tested my mum's sister, because mum's no longer living. She's got some stuff in common with some of us, and you've got some Scandinavian and like this. But we know for a fact that we're all siblings, and that she's a full aunt, not a half aunt, so she's definitely related to the family lines that we are. There's no other reason for the differences in ethnicity other than the random inheritance of which half of your parents' DNA each of you got, what you got in common with each other and what you didn't. And ethnicity as a concept is so rubbery anyway, so they weren't really Italian for 5,000 years anyway. Everybody's come from somewhere else, they just, some that you know and some that you don't know. So
well, there's some controversy around that in Europe.
Yeah, ethnicity is
there's an irony in that, because if you look at the advertisements for particularly Ancestry, but for DNA companies, that's the thing they push. Where do you come from? You know, what is your ethnicity? And yet we know that it's very rubbery. And to be honest, I don't even look at it. I belong. There's 6 in my family, 6 siblings, and we all have. We've all tested with Ancestry now. We've tested with other companies as well, and you know, it's crazy. In theory, we should be the same, but there's all sorts of things, all sorts of different ethnicities coming in.
But I know I'll have to now get involved with the autosomal one, and I have no idea where to start or whether to believe it or where to go.
Well, any advice?
I've got to believe it.
Yeah, I think the close relationships, close matches I do, but as far as having 7% of something,
Oh, the very distant ones can be just inherited, but close ones are close ones, so you can't deny those. I just did it initially, again, same way I fell into doing Ancestry. My husband said, no, just do it. It was a gimmick. So it was an interesting gimmick, but it's become, the gimmick ethnicity part of it is just to me a side thing, but I've been using it for clarifying lines, and I have on a couple of cousins I've met along the way who've had big wars, we've actually solved them with the DNA.
And I think a lot of people get ancestry tests or whatever because they think that's going to give them their family tree.
Yeah.
They don't realise that all it is another tool. Unless you've actually done some genealogical work and built up the basis of a tree, it's going to be nothing to you because you have nothing to compare your matches to.
Unfortunately, that's the way Ancestry sell it, though, don't
yes,
they?
Exactly.
They sell it, look at these discoveries popping up and things like that. My husband insisted on having his Ancestry done right, and I started to prepare him an Ancestry tray, and then he went afterwards, I really only want to know whether I was Celtic or Norman.
That's the least reliable bit of information we're going to get anyway.
I came back as 96.3% British.
I came back as 70% Irish, and we've got nobody Irish in my mother's family.
That's
so it's.
I came back as 33%
no Irish anywhere.
Yeah.
They've got me down as 4% Spanish, which I'm in correspondence with them at the moment saying this is utterly ridiculous. Because when it came back, I thought it would be not 50-50 because you've got bits, my great-grandmother on the other side was Welsh, but to come back as 4% is ludicrous because I've traced the families back sort of generations and generations, all from the same small area as Spain. It's crazy.
I've got less than 1% in my DNA results from Melanesia. So that's interesting, isn't it? Somebody got on a ship a very long time ago. Sailed into a European port.
Lots of people in the groups are obsessed with their ethnicity, though, aren't they?
So unreal.
It's just not worth it. They really are absolutely obsessed with it.
But that brings us back to the question we haven't done yet about how does DNA connect to the rest of the human race? I mean, for goodness sake, we're all connected.
But we know that, don't we?
Yeah. Some people try to hide it, I think, sometimes, but yeah.
I've got one of my lines goes back to the Second Fleet, and one of my ancestors came out in the Second Fleet in 1799. He goes down. He was charged with murdering a couple of Aboriginals. And there's a book written about it, The Blood on the Hawkesbury, and what had happened. Apparently, an Aboriginal or someone that came in and killed some of the settlers, and then my ancestor and 4 or 5 others went out in retribution and killed a couple of Aboriginal boys who weren't the perpetrators. And the book has been made about it, which I have got, and there's a big court case online where they admitted killing them and all that, and it was all there, but the judges couldn't decide what to do with them because Aboriginals, of course, weren't people as such, so it went back to England and they were pardoned, so he got away with it, just was pardoned, don't do it again, and went back to his farm. So that was which I thought was terrible and horrible, but that was where my ancestors that I've found first had connections with them, but I don't think anything in, but so not good from my point of view. I wasn't sort of very happy to find that out, but it was.
Well, I'm finding those kind of not skeletons really, but the kind of difficult stories in your family.
Yeah, I was sort of thought, wow. And I actually had I started to think a lot more about our impact on the Aboriginals and their rights because of that, because I thought I was, many women got over it now, but I was horrified that my ancestors had done that, and I guess more horrified at the time that they got away with it because it was like not really considered a crime. And I thought, how terrible was that?
Let's hear from Erin Battat, a historian who has worked with Ancestry on a variety of their research projects.
Ancestry DNA gave me maps and ethnicity profiles and common surnames for each of the groups that I was studying. And there are a lot of questions that these data could not answer. And most prominently, it could not help me to know how the people themselves identify, how they identify racially or ethnically or in terms of their own cultural background. Race and ethnicity are not genetic categories. They are categories invented by people in order to explain human differences and often to justify inequalities. And so it's not surprising that the ethnicity profiles not only revealed shared common ancestry, but also a history of mixture and movement that produces very complicated identities. And so one example really stands out. A group of people from North Carolina had ethnicity profiles that was predominantly Anglo, but also had significant proportions of African ancestry and Native American ancestry. And their common surnames indicated that many of these people may have been part of a group of Native people in North Carolina called the Lumbee. But there's no way of knowing just from their genetic data whether they identified as Lumbee, whether they identified as Black or African American or as white. There are many cases in which the customer's own sense of themselves, their own knowledge of their our family and group history could tell us a lot more than genetic data. This problem of using genetic data to basically define a cultural group was even more pronounced when dealing with groups where race or indigeneity was a factor. For example, most of the groups that had native ancestry, either in North America or in Polynesia, had significant and even dominant Anglo ancestry. But this mixing had been used historically as a way to dispossess these native people from their land and to force their assimilation. In the context of the United States, many native groups had to prove what was called a blood quantum, that they had enough so-called native blood to justify their sovereignty and their ownership of the land. And so telling a story about ethnic mixing and the mixing of cultures and races became fraught with political implications for some groups. And to further complicate matters, some indigenous groups have resisted genetic testing or genome research as another mode of colonization. So in this case, they feel that the appropriation of genetic data by predominantly Western or white scientists is another form of dispossession. And so I really worried about how my own research, even though the customers who submitted their data did so voluntarily, I worried about how my research was complicit in that.
Krystal Tsosie, who is DNA Navajo, is a geneticist ethicist. As one of a growing number of Native American geneticists, Krystal is an advocate for genomic and data sovereignty and is currently working to establish a tribal nation biobank to protect tribal interests in genomic research. We caught up with Krystal over lunch at the DNA and History Conference in Manchester in January 2019.
In terms of family history and DNA testing, based on like your talk and having chats with you, there's definitely a lot of considerations that perhaps haven't been fully addressed when it comes to Indigenous peoples.
Exactly. Okay, so Indigenous peoples generally don't need to have their identities biologically reified because we define ourselves culturally and by our traditions and our oral histories. So because we have these other definitions, we don't really need to engage in this technology. The problem is when non-Indigenous peoples seek this test to find something to corroborate a family story, and they confuse culturally defining themselves as an identity noun, pronoun, whatever group, with heritage and ancestry. Just because you have an ancestor who is Indigenous doesn't necessarily mean that that person has the rights of an Indigenous person today. And that's hugely problematic, especially when you have people, and I'm not saying all people do this, but there is enough of them to cause natives as a whole to be wary of non-native people who believe that they could learn something about their Indigenous heritage, equate it with Indigenous identity, then try to seek tribal status and enroll so that they could get their perceived right to healthcare or education, which...
And have you seen people actually try and do that on very slim to no basis?
As I mentioned in my talk, I volunteered for the American Indian Association of Tennessee, and Tennessee is in the southeastern part of the U.S., and so a lot of the tribes were removed to Oklahoma further west. So you have a subset of tribal people that escaped that type of persecution, or they were forcibly assimilated, and there's a lot of genetic admixture with African Americans and also European-based individuals. And so there's the story of the Cherokee grandmother, or the Cherokee princess, as we now jokingly refer to it in our native circles. And yes, while I was a volunteer, I would answer phone calls, and one time, I swear, 3 times in the same day. Separate people called asking if they could spend $100 or $200 on one of these direct-to-consumer test kits that corroborates their story, shows that they're Indian, and if they could get a free house out of it.
And did you shout down the phone at them, or were you there?
Oh, I had to, because I was the public face at that moment, acting as a representative of the organization. I couldn't scream down, but at least I could tell them, okay, as a genetic scholar, I could tell you what is incorrect about that statement. And also subtext, our healthcare may be free, so to speak, but it's crap. I'm not sure if you really want access to it anyway.
Do you think that the way in which companies like 23andMe, Ancestry present the results of people's tests are helpful, accurate?
No, they're totally over-exaggerated. Like, if you go to the homepage of Ancestry, on the bottom portion of it, and it's been this way for years, states like, what can I find out about my Native American ancestry? And the problem is, it's a huge problem that these tests will give you a percentage of your heritage is blank Native American, right? And people look at that and go, oh, I am therefore 10% Native, right? And they biologically equate the two, as if 10% of their person, their body, is somehow from an indigenous background. Like, oh, like my thumb is it must be, Native American. Seriously, people have made statements about this, but what people don't realize is that these tests are informed by only a few 100,000 to maybe a couple million biomarkers out of a 3.2 billion base pair genome. So it's like we're talking about 1 to 2% at best. And then when you talk about where those inferences are coming from, they are drawn from Central and South American biomarkers of indigenous groups there, or Eastern Asian biomarkers in the case of 23andMe. And nobody knows the history about how those were unethically procured. But an indigenous person from one side of the U.S. versus the other side will have entirely different genetic histories. And that's true to say that a U.S. native is going to have a different genetic history than somebody in a different part of the Americas. Yeah. But you know that 23andMe and AncestryDNA.com are just playing into this because they're not actually telling the limitations of their technologies, unless it's like in the
this tiniest
print that nobody reads or knows how to interpret anyhow. But
it's definitely not the main message.
No,
they give.
Exactly.
You talked as well about the ways in which companies like Ancestry, 23andMe, but also universities, research bodies, are keen to gather data, genetic data on as many groups of people as possible, including indigenous groups, and the particularly troublesome ways in which they go about this.
So when we talk about ethics in biomedical research, for most people, that discussion ends 1970s Tuskegee, and then we had the Belmont Report, and that fixed everything. That is the narrative that is being taught to trainees, and that scientists actually believe. However, nobody knows about the Hawkesbury tribe, the case that occurred in the late 2000s. Nobody knows about the Human Genome Diversity Project and that history as well, and how recent it is. Part of this too is just a disconnect with non-native ethic that is predominant in science and academia, that is just doesn't match with how we view ourselves. So, for instance, there's this there has been a pervasive notion of ownership of samples, such that one researcher gathered DNA from the Nutchaknuk tribe up in Alaska, and transported it to University of Utah and then across into Oxford, and when he died, these institutions are clamoring for ownership. They're claiming ownership of these samples. Eventually, they got repatriated back to the community, but this is a challenge.
They had to fight to actually get them.
Exactly. And now today, it's not so much, the samples themselves are not as worth as much as the actual genomic information itself.
I thought it was really, well, one of the many interesting things that you talked about was the tension between the individual's sort of right or the individual's choice to take part in a project or to pay to have their DNA tested by a company, and not perhaps be aware of what they're consenting to and what may happen to that data, as opposed to the sort of the impact on the community and the rights of a community. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about, not just in terms of indigenous peoples, but more generally as a society, the way we think about data and consent, particularly genomic data, and maybe, I don't know, what we should be working towards.
So again, the informed consent process was built less on genomic data and information and samples, and more on other different types of samples that are not as invasive as genetic information. So because we can gather so much more information from an individual, not just themselves, but also their family and who else they're related to, or in small vulnerable populations, not just indigenous groups, but others, that inferences can be made about a group as a whole based on one individual, that now there's a question of responsibility, and it almost, in my mind, should cause people to question the extent of individual agency when so much more information and harms can be perpetuated on a group as a whole. This is not disclosed in individual informed consents, that if you're a member of a small vulnerable population, results could be made about your group as a whole, and in the case maybe even challenge your rights to access to resources. That's not disclosed on an individual informed consent form. And if you're thinking about a researcher who's trying, or not even a researcher, because a lot of times this is tasked to individuals who probably have to meet quotas, or they are not as informed about the importance of having a fully informed process, that maybe they're just skipping lines on a form and just reading through it. So this message is being lost to participants who are recruited into these studies, and it's hugely problematic. It's also hugely problematic when we talk about these third-party test sites where people can just upload their information, GEDmatch, and just
it's out there forever.
It's out there. Exactly.
Amazing. Thank you so much
Thank you.
for your time. So I think we've seen really clearly so far the potential for DNA to intervene, often quite directly, in issues and contentions around race, around ethnicity, around identity. So as much as there are potential difficulties and potential negative impacts of this intervention, at the same time, there are also numerous potentials and numerous positive impacts that DNA can have when we're talking about these ideas of heritage and identity and history. The next conversation that we're going to hear, I think, really demonstrates the dual nature, the positives and the negatives that DNA and family history more widely can have on wider ideas of identity. I met up with Jean and Cheryl in a cafe in Ann Arbor, Michigan, just before Christmas. Jean and Cheryl are, among other heritage projects and family history projects, are the organizers of an African American family history society in Washtenaw County, Michigan.
And it's important, and I get up and I talk a lot about our history, because they don't know.
Right, and we had to start our own African American Genealogy Society for Washtenaw County. Because the presentations that regular genealogy society, they talk about the Germans and the Polish ancestors, but they never talk about African American genealogy, or even relate to, well, if you were doing this for African Americans, it would be this way. They don't even, it just isn't within their frame of reference. And so we started our own genealogy society for that reason, because if we're going to help each other, and that's sort of what the society is for, is to help each other and to teach each other. But if they never mention African American, and if you have to be the one to say, how does this relate to us? How does it, and they haven't given it a thought. Then it's like it makes it too hard.
So I've been given presentations.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I said in my last one, in introduction, when we do our genealogy, it's a little different because we're recorded till 1870. Prior to that, we're a piece of furniture.
Yeah, we're property.
We're just property. So I told them that when they find that their ancestors owned slaves, they need to talk about it because that helps. It really helps in race relationships.
Yeah.
It helps everything, and you need to tell because we have a hard time. Some of us have a hard time finding it. We're seasoned genealogists, so we know how to do it. But for the most part, if you knew that your ancestors owned slaves and you have a name, share it with other African American people, or tell us, like Roger told us.
Right. Because if you talk about it, then we pass the word on to somebody else. So like I told Roger, I said Alabama. So I know people that in Fred Hart Williams who are looking for ancestors in Alabama. So hey, I can say, hey, let me give Roger your name or vice versa, and see if there's a connection, because that's what people are looking to trace their ancestors back to the plantation, and then they can, if they've been dispersed, find them from there. And otherwise we're lost because we don't have that connection, or the connection has been lost for so long. I'm fortunate because my aunt on my mother's side, because all of her family went to Canada and they have immaculate records. I mean, they have kept the records, and because my family was there early, they've kept. We know the history, so I know my family's history on my mother's side, and on my father's side, they stayed in the same place.
Okay.
So they stayed in Vanderbilt, and so that makes my history easy to do. But for other people, it's hard. It's looking for a needle in a haystack.
And see, slavery broke up families, and what DNA is doing for us is putting them back together. And because we are, like I said, my son-in-law and I share the same relative. We didn't know that, and so that's important for us to know who our ancestors and our relatives are. And it's like, wow, I just met, from the DNA search, I met someone who I'm connected to, and we just clicked. We talked on the phone. She lived in Ipsy. She graduated the same year I did, and then she passed away, like this year. And so we had little time together. But the time that we spent on the phone and talking about our families and stuff that I didn't know, it was just, I can't tell you how that felt. Yeah. So, it's just
You mentioned like the idea of, when you find like Roger, who found that he had ancestors who were slaveholders, and the idea of sort of like talking about it and trying to, have those conversations. Is that something that you've done on other occasions already, or is it something you'd like to do?
I just did it for them because when you don't know and you don't know, then it was something that I thought of that would bring about, because we're not in that society. We're not included because there's no one there. So I just thought about that. I'm going, that's a good way to connect and talk about race. It wasn't, because a lot of white people feel guilty about their ancestors owning slaves. That's the way it was, You would be surprised at the number of African American people. They accept that. We accept it.
Right. That's why my heart was broken when I lost my beta match. When she took her stuff out.
So the beta match is when you've got 4 people who are direct descendants. So did you have one as well that you had a match?
I had one, and they took her off too.
As in, like, so
they just,
one of the other people.
One of the other people, right?
Cut them off, so you can't be. But it was Kentucky, and I believe it was my. My grandmother. Along the line.
So I'm thinking about DNA as a historical source. Because obviously you can follow the paper records and tell you so much, but the beta matches only come up when you get the DNA things. So DNA is like, it's scientific fact. It's telling you that, there is definitely a relationship here. But then there's people who have getting given a fact and then deciding
I don't want
to
this
accept
fact
this fact.
because I don't want this person in my family. Because I think it's hard for white people to explain, maybe.
Mm-hmm. They have black folks in
and one of the, I was researching because I said I printed out the DNA printed out the names before she took us out. So Sally. So I said, okay, let me find out what I can find about Sally. Well, Sally's actually on her tree had her mother's name, Esther Baker. I said, I never knew that was Jane King's mother, because when she came to Canada, all of that history was gone.
It's one thing when people were able to kind of bury these things, and it was very difficult to actually find those links. But surely, like, the more people who do the DNA testing, the more that it's just proven, like, no question, here's where you're related, here's that. Like, I mean, and we're talking like 150, 200 years ago, when these things happen. Like, do you think DNA maybe, just by the fact it just is going to keep bringing up more, maybe is going to force people to actually address?
I think so.
Terms.
Because people like me will be writing and saying we're cousins, and this is how we're related. This is how, so put your data information back in.
And then I think too, like when I addressed everybody at the Washington Genealogy Society, and I told them, when I was talking about the introduction to genealogy, I told them the difference between African American genealogy and white genealogy. And I told them when we study slavery, that's important for you to share that with us. And we know it was hard and it was bitter and it was cruel, but you're not responsible for your ancestors here. But this will help, and I believe after a while, when people start accepting it that it's a science, and then that science really doesn't lie, and that you're more connected than you are. That things will get better as you can use it as healing.
Yeah, well, like Thomas Jefferson's family, they finally have gotten to the place where they see themselves as family. They finally, after going through the denials and all of the we're going to sue and all of the ramifications of what that meant, to then be able to say we're family.
Yeah.
And it's all said and done, we're family.
It's that. I'm going to be teaching Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson in like February. But that's almost like that was one of the first big DNA discoveries.
Right.
But no, it's interesting how you say actually as an example to everyone else. If it has actually it's taken them 20 years.
Exactly. So put me back, get back in the beta match.
That's it for now. Thanks for listening. In our next podcast, we'll be exploring the phenomenon of family history more widely, specifically looking at skills, community, and education.
We'll be following that up with some talk around the wider public understanding of genetics and genetic genealogy, including some great interviews from our science event in January 2019 at the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester.